You're listening to Hack Your HazCom. I'm Atanu Das, your host. This is a space where we break down the complex and make it manageable. To get the most out of this show, visit hackyourhazcom.com, where you'll find our entire catalog of episodes, show notes, and a place to join the discussion. If you have an idea for a future episode, I want to hear about it. Submit your suggestions directly through the website. Now, let's get to work. Welcome again to Hack Your HazCom. Today, my guest is Ken Sumner of KWS Training. He is a professional dangerous good transportation trainer with over 30 years of experience in the 49 CFR, the IATA, DGR, and IMDG regulations. He has trained thousands of students from a wide variety of industries and research organizations in the requirements to ship an enormous variety of hazardous materials. He's attended the original Department of Transportation Train the Trainer program in Oklahoma City in the 90s and regularly attends training provided by a wide variety of organizations to maintain a high degree of current knowledge. Welcome, Ken.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and that we could work out a time to talk about some interesting stuff.
Yeah, so I wanted to have you on because this topic of the Department of Transportation regulations and where it intersects with hazard communication is an ongoing challenge of ours. And, longtime listeners may know that we've had an earlier conversation with your colleague, Gene Sanders, about this very thing. And I thought we need to continue on this discussion because it's a challenge I face a lot of times with my clients, customers. I'm sure you get it too. Otherwise, you wouldn't be training in this transport, world here. So let's have you delve right in here. What do you see as common problems with Section 14 of the SDS? And again, that's the transport section that we encounter.
Um, so I always thought that as we had these great new tools, we went from, yes, I'm really old, went from having to do everything by hand and paper to, ooh, these really cool fax machines and, oh, the internet and now AI, and all these problems were going to disappear. And I did some searches yesterday on acetic acid glacial, and I found problems. So what I was expecting is that we would get better and better, and we have with safety data sheets, but there's still consistently problems with no classification at all, wrong classifications, classifications where they haven't done the tests yet. They have a sample of something they've created, and so what they do is they classify based on what the ingredients are, and they default to the worst case, which isn't actually true for the thing you have. Or somebody gives you a safety data sheet for the finished product. Great. They give you a safety data sheet for a powder. And then you realize it's actually a spray. And yeah, it's spraying out the powder, but you have a safety data sheet that only reflects the powder, not the gas that's in this aerosol that is spraying out the powder. And I'm constantly running up against things like that. Or they give you a safety data sheet for a novel compound, and it's a solid, but they've put it on ethanol. And so now the safety data sheet doesn't match what you have in hand. And so that's the kind of thing that you regularly see. Also, out of date Section 14s where the regulations have changed and nobody went back in to make the changes. Or I found one not too long ago that was they reformulated slightly. They did a flashpoint test. The flashpoint made it a packing group 3 flammable liquid, but their safety data sheet, section 14, was never updated by the person, the scientist, who put in the new flashpoint. He got flashpoint data, he put it in the safety data sheet, he's done. Except that it meant instead of being packing group 2, it should be packing group 3 and less dangerous. And that change was never made. So that's just kind of some of the things that I keep saying.
Yeah, and I think especially with now OSHA, we're in transition right now with the GHS and what we have to do with our safety data sheets. The new adaptation, many of our listeners may know that we have to account for downstream uses, changes in the physical properties in our SDSs. So it's very important like you said, when we aren't covering those, we are truly not communicating. So, how do you approach identifying these problems you've identified here?
So one of them is since I do a lot of work with clients, I'm not at one site all the time. I count on them to tell me what they have. So I'll spend a lot of time asking for product descriptions. What is it exactly? What form is it in? What did you do to it? And then because you have all sorts of exceptions in the transportation regulations, it's how much is in the container? How many containers do you want to put in a shipping case? Because that's going to inform whether you can do something like dangerous goods in accepted quantity or limited quantity or one of the other cool exceptions. So I start with, guys, tell me what you want to do and what you've got. Then I'll compare that to what the safety data sheet says. And yeah, you're going to Google and Bing and whatever other search engine you like um, to figure out, are the properties that you're seeing for the pure substance or the substance you actually see in front of you, or that the client has described. Um, and so I'll spend some time doing that, and then go through and compare it to the criteria to be honest, the IATA regulations are easier to read up front for most people, and classifying per the IATA regulations as your initial step is very common for me. Air is, of course, most restrictive type of shipment, so you want to make sure that one's right. But you do then need to go to the other sets of regulations and make sure that those classifications actually work. One that came up was somebody who was not my client, it was one of their competitors, was shipping something they described as an aerosol. And if you read the definition of an aerosol in the IATA dangerous goods regulations, that classification makes sense. But if you read the definition of aerosol in 49 CFR, it specifically says that it has to be for the sole purpose of expelling a liquid, powder, or paste. That's why the gas is in the container. That is not what it says in the IATA regs, which means something like pure butane, pure liquefied butane in a container, which is what this rival of my client had, um, isn't an aerosol in the United States. And so that classification that was on the safety data sheet of UN 1950 aerosols flammable wasn't appropriate for U.S. shipment. So you're going to have to use both sets of regs. So then I'll, as I said, get everything I can from the client, compare it to the regs, and then do some searches. Um, and you have to sit and think. There's two that I looked up when we first scheduled this session. I have a lot of clients that do ethanol-based hand sanitizer, or isopropanol-based hand sanitizer, or a mix of ethanol and isopropanol, or it doesn't contain alcohol at all and is not regulated in transport. So the safety data sheets for hand sanitizers can be all over the place. And so I looked up a couple that I've been playing with, and the two examples of when I looked at the safety data sheet, I went, something doesn't match between the ingredients and the classification. The first one was, it said it was a mixture, and forgive me, I have the percentages right here. Um, it was ethanol 65 to 100%.
Wow. Okay.
That's a pretty wide
Range.
gap.
Yeah.
But then it had isopropanol that was 5 to 35%. Well, those are pretty broad. And if you take your minimums, they, on the safety data sheet, said that it was an ethanol solution and packing group 3. Well, when you look at the flash point and the boiling point on the safety data sheet, um, it doesn't make sense because the flash point and boiling point showed it to be packing group 2. If you're over 70% ethanol, you're pretty much regularly going to fall into packing group 2. And so not only did I have a problem with the packing group, in thinking about the name ethanol solution, it doesn't make sense. It should be alcohols NOS as your classification, because ethanol solution is only if ethanol is the only hazardous material. But 5 to 35% isopropanol,
Is
that counts.
also right.
So that was one from 2020. Not that old, but a little old.
Mm-hmm.
I found another one for a different hand sanitizer that was from 2024, and it said the only hazardous ingredient was 60 to 79% ethanol. Okay, ethanol solution definitely would work.
Hmm.
On the safety data sheet, again, they had ethanol packing group 3, but if it's over 70%, it's packing group 2. And then I looked at what they had as a note, and they said, hey, it can go as limited quantities in 1 liter sizes. But if it's packing group 3 and you're using the US rules, the limited quantity amount for packing group 3 is 5 liters. So what's right? Should it have been packing group 2? Should it be packing group 3? So based on the flash point and the boiling point, I told my client, do it as packing group 2. And if it really was 65%, then yeah, it could have been packing group 3, but you have no way of proving it because they don't give that to you.
Right.
And so we went with worst case, called it packing group 2, limited our limited quantity amount to 1 liter instead of 5. So that's just an example of trying to work through those problems.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I think what do you do in the cases of if the testing hasn't been done, like that instance of boiling point, flash point? I mean, do you insist on getting the proper testing done or make sure the client knows what the implications are?
Well, so it's tough because I do a lot with like pharmaceutical companies that are just whipping something up in the lab. Just boom, we're creating it now, and there's not going to be test data, not for a while. And so they'll default to worst case. And I hate the sample rule. It's really useful if you need it, but the sample rule is defaulting you to the worst case of packing group 1, which means they're harder to ship, your amounts are much limited, and if you have a sample that contains ethanol and ethanol is the only hazardous material, it's never going to be packing group 1. It could be packing group 2 or packing group 3. It could be a flammable liquid or it could be not regulated at all. So if you know enough about it, you guesstimate, but with good scientific reason. If I know the only thing that went into it are flammable liquids and flammable liquids in packing group 2 and 3, then it's reasonable to assume that it's a flammable liquid no worse than packing group 2.
Right.
And you pick a name based
Okay.
on that. Um, some of the problem comes in with what about trade secrets?
Mm.
So you have, especially pharmaceutical companies, they don't want to tell you what they're doing. They won't tell anybody what they're doing. And so it makes safety data sheets difficult. It makes test data difficult. And so one of the things I did is look at what's your line of research. So a company was looking at trying to do weight loss drugs.
Mhm.
Weight loss drugs, just on average in the research environment, tend to be not regulated, certainly not toxic. But you compare that to somebody doing cancer drugs. And what is the point of a cancer drug? It is to kill the bad cells. So those tend to be toxic. So then you start from a perspective of what do I know about the research going on and what they've done, and then how can I interpret that into what they're doing? And then you try to ask them what family it's from. If you can get a chemical family, then you can kind of guesstimate, yeah, this is probably going to be toxic, and probably toxic packing group 2 or whatever. Um, but you're right, it gets tricky with the test data. Um, Sometimes, though, encouraging the client to spend the money to do the tests can pay off. Years ago, there was a topical medicine. They had isopropanol in it, and they reformulated, and it had been 35% isopropanol. They way lowered it. And when they sent it out for testing, it was this really thick, gooey stuff, and it didn't actually sustain combustion when they retested it. So when they reformulated it, if they kept using the old safety data sheet, first of all, it would have been wrong. Second of all, it would have indicated that it was a flammable liquid, and they have to keep shipping as a hazardous material. They got the retest data. We were able to get them to ship it as non-regulated. Gene Sanders, speaking of him, he was involved with that back then. And they were able to ship it non-regulated from the day they got the test data. Now, one of the practical problems you have is if people look at a safety data sheet, especially one that they have from a year ago, and you're sending them something that's been reformulated and they don't have a new safety data sheet yet, they're going to say, you got a regulated material, you got a problem. So we had to write a letter saying, reformulated, retested, here's the test data, and we're using, so for example, in the IATA regulations, we quoted special provision A3, which says if you test it and it doesn't match the hazard class from the dangerous goods list, then you can ship it not regulated if it's, falling out of classification. So we explain that in each set of the regulations is a rule like that, and then millions of dollars in shipping charges saved.
Yeah. And only for the testing data did you get to that point, right? The
Yeah,
updated test. Yeah.
yeah. And um, that can be a definite benefit. And if you can get them to do the math, if they're going to repetitively ship something, those tests really can pay off.
Right. Right. Interesting. Okay. What about other examples of issues clients face when having matching information or trying to match the information with an SDS to the transportation requirements?
Some of it is a disconnect between what you're actually shipping and what the safety data sheet says. So some safety data sheets will give you a base classification and no information about exceptions. And it's up to you. I kind of tend to like that because it makes somebody know more about the regs and have to dig it up and look at what they actually have. One of the problems I've seen is when they put in information about it being an accepted quantity or a limited quantity. Well, number one, it depends on which rules you're looking at. The air rules are more restrictive for limited quantities than the ground rules.
Sure.
Then, second of all, it really does depend on what amount you have. And so sometimes there's a disconnect between the amount per bottle, the amount per package, and then what it says on a safety data sheet. And somebody needs to research that in the shipping regulations to make sure that they're actually getting it right. One of the more interesting ones I had is where the safety data sheet was fine, it was correct, but people didn't think about what it meant. And that was a toothpaste. And most toothpastes are not regulated, right? But this was an aerosol toothpaste.
Oh,
So it was pressurized. And on the safety data sheet, aerosols, UN 1950, it was aerosols non-flammable. So it was a cool little toothpaste experiment. And they were doing a test market. Well, no one sent the safety data sheet to the warehouse. The warehouse assumed it was going to be a toothpaste like any other toothpaste. They get it, and they're told that it needs to be next dayed, shipped from the state they're in to an entirely different state overnight, which means air shipment, right?
right.
Nobody told them or went ahead and said the safety data sheet for this is different.
Right.
And so we had to figure out how can we get it there because they'd spent I don't know, it was like $1 million on an advertising campaign in that state for a test market.
Wow.
Oops.
Yeah. Big time oops. Yeah.
So that was one where it was just a disconnect between the people and the safety data sheet. One that I looked at last year, it's a hand sanitizer again, and it was clearly a flammable liquid hand sanitizer. And the safety data sheet section 14, when it came to the classification, said see bill of lading. Uh, I'm trying to create a shipping paper for this. No, how many people actually save an incoming shipping paper? You'll save the packing slip to prove that you got it and you do your check and make sure it matches your order. But most folks don't save an incoming hazardous material shipping paper unless you're lucky.
Mhm.
And so you get no idea what the classification is because it just says CBOL. And I thought that one was a bit lame. Um, some others I've saw are okay. There's a really good one. It says aerosols UN 1130. I'm not aerosols. Sorry, adhesives UN 1133. It's class 3, packing group 2, and it says that classification for, and they have them in a line on the safety data sheet. And so you're thinking really good. They've got the DOT classification, the IMDG classification, and the air classification. But when you get over to the air classification, it doesn't say aerosols. Did it again.
Adhesives.
Adhesives, UN 1133, and it doesn't say that. What it says is Consumer Commodity ID 8000. Now in America, we got rid of Consumer Commodity ORMD many, many, many years ago. So Consumer Commodity ID 8000 is a special kind of rule classification in the air regs that allows you to put several different things in the same box and use one proper shipping name. So you can put, now I'll get it right, aerosols and adhesives in the same box and call them Consumer Commodity ID 8000. There's lots of limits on it. You can't do corrosives that way, can't do poisons that way, and so on. But the problem is if you have a classification of Consumer Commodity ID 8000, it doesn't work by the other modes and is confusing. So are you better off just leaving the base classification and letting a shipper figure out whether they can do that or not? Or is it better to have it? I don't know. I mean, as somebody who does the rest of the safety data sheet, what do you think? Would you prefer having the exceptions like consumer commodity or limited quantity listed, or would you like to have that left where you have to figure it out?
I I would prefer the latter because again, if going back to what OSHA's doing, it's encompassing and accounting for downstream uses, right? And what is your end user ultimately going to do with it? So I would see that as the same. The transport. I mean, how are you transporting it? What mode? What else are you shipping it with? I would say yes. If you are savvy enough to look into the regulations and know that, this is the conundrum we have in communication as a whole, right? That SDS is not always all things to everyone. Who is your end user? Who is reading that? How well trained are they? You know, you mentioned earlier if you put everything as an exception or you at least show in section 14, I've seen it where you outline the exact CFR reference, right? And
Yeah.
where you find those. Maybe that's good. At least it's showing you where to look. But if you don't have anything in there, you're relying on your end user. What do you do there, right? That is a conundrum. So I would say, short answer, it depends, right?
Yeah. Well, and you made me think about the example I gave earlier where the ethanol solution was listed as limited quantity 1 liter. Well, on that safety data sheet, they weren't clear whether they were looking at the U.S. ground rules, which are very liberal. I mean, for packing group 3, you could have up to 5 liters. Packing group 2, 1 liter per bottle. But if you look at the air rules, the amounts are different. And ocean rules are different again.
Mhm.
And so, how much do you put?
Right,
Now,
right.
sometimes I want more information,
Sure.
but you're not going to always get it. One of the ones that I like to get, especially if it's a flammable liquid that, with alcohols, is the water percentage. Because there's a rule in each of the regulations that if you're a 24% or less aqueous solution of alcohol, now particularly ethanol is what you're looking for, um, you can fall completely out of the regulations if you're an aqueous solution, which means what? Over 50% water.
Mhm.
So you're not giving me the percentage of water on the safety data
No,
sheet.
it
And
drops out. Yeah.
that was another one. There was a mouthwash that a client had that was 16.9% ethanol. And when that tiny little store called Walmart that, nobody wants their product in, um, is harassing them saying, "You're shipping us a flammable liquid, no marks, no labels, no shipping paper." It was well worth it to explain to my client, then explain to Walmart, "Hey, there's these exceptions. It's 16.9% ethanol, and now I had to go to the client. The client the individual I was talking to was like, I don't know what the water percentage is. And so it took like 3 or 4 internal communications to get to somebody who could tell us it was 60% water.
Wow.
But effort well worth it because now you're shipping something that Walmart was saying, this is a flammable liquid. And you could say, no, no, it's not, and make it really easy to ship, millions of dollars saved in shipping charges, right?
True.
And it's so I like to tell clients when I'm teaching them is, are you willing to read for 15 minutes to save thousands of dollars? You're not going to like the reading. You're not going to like how they word it.
Right.
But if you can puzzle through it in 15 minutes, would you like to save thousands of dollars? And most say, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why you're there for doing what you do, the training piece, right? It's you're in it like I am. It's the communication piece, right? Ultimately, you're trying to get somebody to understand the compliance and why we do what we do. And I agree with you. It's if you can explain the opportunity cost of, like you said, reading versus what is the ROI that you're getting on that, opportunity of actually understanding the regs. That's a perfect example.
Yeah, I do the whole, hold up the reg book, this giant thing of pages. I said, this is, a giant wall in your way. My job is to turn it into a speed bump.
Right.
You know,
I love
is
it. That's
let's
fantastic.
let's learn how to use the book to find the advantages we
Yep.
can and to do it right.
Yeah.
Um, so, all right. So, for you, one of the things that occurred to me when we were talking was the GHS
Right.
symbols and signs.
Right.
And so, a lot of people will ask, how do they translate into transportation warnings? And there's some that are pretty close. But I was curious as to how you address, what do the GHS symbols mean in different regulatory environments, not just OSHA, but DOT and EPA.
Sure. Well, so that's a good question. I mean, the first, I say, trepidation that we get with our customers and clients is, I want to have an SDS that's compliant to everywhere. You've got the globally, quote, harmonized system. I like to say it's generally harmonized because we're not quite there yet. And and especially where here in the US, you have sections that are optional, right? You have different kingdoms like the EPA, you've got OSHA, you've got, DOT, the transport, and never the three will agree on things. And don't even get me started on consumer labeling, right? That's a whole
Oh,
nother ball of wax there. But getting back to the question, so you're right. It's not always an even overlap of where GHS begins and other rules end, and never the two meet. I try to explain it in basic terms, kind of like with the test data, why we have test data. Flashpoint, boiling point gets us to an endpoint in both GHS and in DOT regulations. Once they see it that way, I think they understand some of that. But you get into areas where something doesn't match in a GHS classification and something needs to be identified, maybe as environmental marine pollutant or something. Why aren't we talking about that in the U.S. regs? Well, there is no adoption of aquatic toxicity, for example. We don't have to identify that here in the U.S. So it goes into several extrapolations of explaining it to another person. I think I would then get somebody like yourself involved, right? Hey, I've got a colleague who really understands the nuances of transport. Let's have a three-way call and talk it out. Where we can match up our GHS, why or why not it matters in section 14, and the explanation. So this is where I try to overcome and get to your point, a speed bump, right? That's
yeah.
get that wall down to something that makes sense and hopefully get them and finally into that money question. What's your ROI? What's your why do we want to get to this point of fully understanding where transport and GHS meet or don't meet?
Yeah, and it's funny that you brought up the environmentally hazardous concept,
Yes.
because that is one. I mean, it's not new, but it's newer.
Right.
Last decade or so, where they made the Daphne water organism test, just kind of ubiquitous. Um, but things changed, and there were things that were not regulated in the past that became regulated. But then that's not exactly true, because a lot of the environmentally hazardous stuff becomes not regulated if you're non-bulk going by ground in the United States. There's a limitation that it is advantageous. So what do you do if the safety data sheet says it's an environmentally hazardous substance? Somebody's got to be trained enough to go, wait, for this individual shipment of 2 bottles of 1 liter each, does this actually apply, or does it fall completely out of the regs and is not regulated?
Right. Right.
I run into the same thing with like solids containing flammable liquid, where it's like alcohol prep pads or even
Wipes, maybe.
polymeric beads, wipes, yeah, but polymeric beads that are soaked with stuff from a manufacturing thing. Um, and there's a rule that if you're, as you know, under 10 milliliters and it doesn't have freestanding liquid and it's in a foil pack, you're completely out of the regulations.
Right.
But the safety data sheet, what should it say? Should it say you're completely out of the regs? Um, the thing I fear with that is where I've seen safety data sheets meant to cover a whole different bunch of products
Oh,
and different sizes. And if you get over the milliliter limit for the alcohol in the and those are pretty big prep pads, but they have those. And now you can't fall out of the regs and you are solids containing flammable liquid. So if you're trying to cover a whole bunch of products, which I've seen, it means this the classification can be confusing.
right. Right. And that's again, when you try to use an SDS for a catch all, you run into these problems, right? Again, and explaining them. So I 100% hear you here, and hopefully our audience gets through on the point. So,
Well, I like what you're saying about the idea of it, all things to everybody, and you just can't do that.
no,
You can provide really good information, but it's not going to cover every single possible situation.
no,
And
no.
that's where that the idea of AI is going to help us in our jobs. It will, but it's not going to replace some thinking.
I hope, yeah, I know you're right on that. It's the nuances and the gray areas. So that's why we do what we do, I think, right?
Yeah. And, oh, okay. You reminded me of funny story. I share it a lot because it just got me. Which is, I go into this warehouse that ships and sends things, sells things to laboratories, and they set up a computer system where they went through safety data sheets, they looked at hazardous materials, they looked at classifications, and they made sure that you know if you had a corrosive and a dangerous when wet, they wouldn't end up in the same box. So they went through and they checked all the compatibility of all the signs and symbols behind me with the classifications. But here's what they missed, and it goes back to AI prompts: is you have to prompt AI the right way.
Mhm.
Um, and it was a mercury thermometer made of glass. So you have a hazardous material, mercury, in a glass thermometer going in a box with metal rods. You know the heavy metal rods you put in a Bunsen burner stand, and then
Sure.
you can put stuff up and down the Bunsen burner? So these really heavy, dense rods are in this box with a glass thermometer. And the fellow who was doing it kept saying, but the computer says they're compatible. The computer says I can do it 4 times. I was like, but metal smashes glass. And so, granted, that has not much to do with a safety data sheet, but it does have to do with the common sense and the limitations of AI. Because if you don't prompt it right, it's going to give you an answer that just doesn't work.
That's right. That's right. And it gets back to what is your experience and knowledge in this field, right? So excellent point. What about I think you touched on a little bit of this with Section 14 and translating that into proper packaging selection. What do we run into there?
So that's one that you go again, circle back to what did the client tell me about the format of what they want to ship? What do they describe it as? Um, how much per package? If you get into aerosols, one of the things that I really wish they did on safety data sheets was clearly indicate pressure,
Mhm.
because there are different requirements at different pressures in the regulations, but that's just not something they generally put.
No.
And that can be frustrating, so you got to get technical data. um, but amounts per bottle, amounts per case, go to the classification, and now you have to do the think through. So it's not just picking the rule. What I like to tell clients, the best way to ship your hazardous material is the one that fits your business needs the best and that you understand how to do. So, an example of that: I had a client that shipped a oxidizer that could go on passenger aircraft. I showed them how to do it. I showed them how to do cargo aircraft only. And they went, we're going to do cargo aircraft only. We're only doing 5 shipments a year. We took the safety data sheet, we looked at the classification, we went to the book. Passenger aircraft scares us. We're going to only do cargo aircraft only because we don't ever want to bring down a passenger flight by messing up.
Right.
Okay. I've had other clients who go, look, we ship thousands of packages a day. Show us the cheapest way to do this. Well, in many cases, it's do it as a limited quantity by ground. And so now you got to take your classification. You got to go in and look up each and every item that they ship and see what is allowed for limited quantity, what's your total amount, can you mix these things in a box, and now you train all of their line people to do ground shipments of limited quantities. And they do that every day. But if something is going to go by air, it gets kicked off the line to somebody who's had much more full training and will go into the air book and do it because limited quantity air is completely different. And so even though some of their stuff could go as dangerous goods and accepted quantities, they don't do it. Much faster and easier to do it as limited quantity. They also don't do it because one of the things I see people who look at the safety data sheet, they look at the amount they're shipping, they go, oh, this could go under dangerous goods and accepted quantity, and they just put it in a box. They'll do the triple layers of protection. They'll stay within the quantity limits. They'll put absorbent in there, but they put it in a box, not a tested box. If you look at dangerous goods and accepted quantity, one of the things that would never show up on a safety data sheet to warn you is, hey, there's drop tests and stacking tests that need to be done on your system. It will include the bubble wrap, the absorbent pad, the leak-proof liner, Ziploc, whatever you're using. And you need to make a box, use water or flour as your hazmat substitute, and then drop it and stack it per the rules. And then document that you did this, document all the pieces and parts. So you can use any box you want as long as you test it. At no point does the safety data sheet explain this to you. At no point does just calling it an accepted quantity work. You got to go into the regs and find out. You have to test your box system. I like to call it a system because people think, oh, I'm just testing the box. No, you're testing the tape. And if you change the tape, you invalidated your test.
Wow.
And so you need to go back and test with your new tape. If you change box vendors, it doesn't matter that it's the same size, the same thickness, and all that. You have to go and retest your box. If you go from 3/16 inch bubble wrap to a 1/4 inch bubble wrap, got to retest. And that's not going to be reflected anywhere in your connection to the safety data sheet and the initial classification, especially if they put in there, oh, it can go as dangerous goods and accepted quantity. Some people see the word accepted quantity and they think, oh, I'm accepted from the rules. I don't have to do anything. Oh, it looks like you've run into that.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's one that can really just sneak up and bite you on the butt.
Right. And in that case, do you recommend, so that testing, is that something, I would imagine all that is spelled out somewhere, what testing equipment is or how to test? Is that in like a UN manual or?
So for dangerous goods and accepted quantities, it's super fun. I like to do it. I try to get them to hire me to come to it because you know what we do? We drop boxes, we kick them, we throw them, we stack them. It's just a fun afternoon. But the tests are explained in the dangerous goods and accepted quantity rule. And so anybody can do them. I've done them many times for my clients. And I used to do the required tests, and then I'd give one of my kids a sledgehammer, and I'd say, go back out in the backyard and smash that box, and we're going to video it. And we'd take it out, and we'd smash it, or I'd drive it all over with a truck, or I'd throw it off the top of a building. And just fun stuff. Because you find out to do these tests is not hard, and the truth is, if you just follow some basic process rules, it's really safe. The sledgehammer one, they had plastic bottles that they were using. The kid dented the heck out of the plastic bottles. Not a single one broke.
Oh, okay.
And that's the thing, right? Is you're demonstrating to the regulators that you're above and beyond the regulations. It's not hard to do. But the basic drop and stacking tests are really simple, really easy. The regulations, for example, specify you drop them from 5.9 feet onto a solid, unyielding surface in every orientation, so sides and corners and tops and bottoms. I have my clients do it from 6 feet, so higher. And when we get done with the drop test, we do all the tests on that one box, even though the regulations say you can change out and do a different box. No. Same box, and then do the stacking test on that same box after it's been dropped. I haven't had a failure yet as long as they followed my advice.
Interesting.
And then when you get done with the stacking test for 24 hours, that's when, like, I've got a farmer buddy who had steel toe boots on. And I said, have at it. He's like, really? I said, yeah. I said, go nuts. And he threw it as hard as he could into the ground. He stomped on it. He crushed. I've got video of him, like,
Oh, that's great.
and again, and those were glass vials. He smashed the heck out of it. No leaks. But again, I didn't mean to get off on that tangent, but as an example, it doesn't say anywhere on your safety data sheet that you need to do this. And so when you're taking a safety data sheet classification and then turning it into action, that's where, as you said, you can't be all things to all people. People have to be trained on the regs, have to go in the regulations and see if it's applicable to what they want to do. But the cool thing about, like, I was mentioning the client that does limited quantities and not dangerous goods and accepted quantity, because they don't have to test the boxes. If you read the regulation for limited quantity, it says it has to be capable of a 4-foot drop, capable of a stack test. Not that you actually have to do them. But dangerous goods and accepted quantity says as demonstrated by prototype testing that is properly documented.
Wow.
And so again, we go back to what's right for your business. What do your people understand the best? What fits your business need? So, boy, that was a long-winded way to say one size does not fit all.
At all, right? No, but it matters. And I think you are kind of the first person I've heard talking about the details of drop testing. And that's important, right? Our listeners should be aware because you don't always think about that. Like you said, if I can read across a set of regulations and feel like, oh, that covers me, I'm good, fine. What about documentation? For me, it's all about, document your work, show your work. If somebody were to ask you how you got to that, you have something to show them, right? We demonstrated this.
Yeah,
Very
every
important.
time I do the dangerous good and accepted quantity test, I write a report. I have video, I have picture. I mean, why not video things in today's technology
Right.
technology world? It's just too easy.
Mhm.
And so there will be a report listing every SKU number, every vendor that they bought the stuff from, which tape, how wide it is, when you put it on the box, how many inches you go up the side. Um, so basically, you're creating your own kit, your own
Right.
system. Some clients, though, will look at a classification on a safety data sheet, go, oh, this is corrosive. That scares me. You know what? I know I could use one of the exceptions. I'm just going to use specification packaging. And that's where you're buying someone else having done the UN tests.
Right.
So dangerous goods and accepted quantity gives you a lot of flexibility, but skipping an exception and going for just straight up specification packaging gives you confidence.
Right.
It gives you a company behind it that did the testing. As long as you pick a good manufacturer who did the tests.
Sure.
Um, I have run into some where people didn't know what they were doing. As far as I know, those aren't on the market anymore.
Rightfully so.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And you bring up some great points here as far as how important an SDS is. And when you run into clients, do they understand the concept of having an up-to-date or current safety data sheet? And why do you recommend that?
So it's been interesting. I have done less and less classifier training through the years. If I have somebody who really wants to be a good, I'm going to go and look at when the flame passes the wetted zone in a test and get into the nitty gritty of all that, I send him to Gene Sanders because he's awfully good at that. But I find that fewer and fewer of my clients want to do the classification stuff because they want a good safety data sheet, and they're making other people create safety data sheets, and then they follow what it says. I try to teach them to be good question askers. If you look at a safety data sheet and you see a flashpoint, can you compare that to the regs and see if you agree or disagree with it being packing group 2 or 3? If you see a boiling point, did you bring that over and compare it on the flammable liquid um, flashpoint chart
Right.
for determining your packing group?
Right.
LD50s, those are easy targets. But I find that more and more of them are expecting and get a completed safety data sheet. So then it becomes talking about what are you looking for to determine that you're happy with it, comparing it to the regs, comparing the ingredients. Did they classify based on just the worst ingredient, or did they actually look at the formulation? Like I saw a 62% solution of ethanol that they classified as if it was pure ethanol.
Right.
That's not the same.
Right. Right.
Um, and look for those. And I suggest that safety data sheets be no more than 3 years old. But I have an 11-year-old one that I have a picture of in one of my classes that I keep it in there as a point of, does this need to change?
Right.
And the answer is, when you look at section 14, it's all current. Nothing has changed about that chemical in 11 years in terms of its classification for transport. Versus, I have a 3-year-old safety data sheet, but they did it wrong in the first place.
Just
Um,
carries over those mistakes over and over.
but I really do encourage them to go with 3 years or newer. And 2015 brought such a wave of better safety data sheets because of how they changed to the 16 part form and they made that the deadline and everything. How about you? Are you finding just wrong safety data sheets on a regular basis?
It's gotten better. I mean, certainly it's, much better than the Wild West of the 8 section OSHA, what we used to have, decades ago. Time to time, you still see that coming up on the internet. But I agree with you. Having a set of sections, required headings, even though there are still optional sections, it's still being addressed. I think because of worldwide trade, you need to have, if I'm selling here in the US as well as the EU, you better be sure that there is some consistency between the two formats as best as you can. Um, I find with issues on trade secrets, that's a whole nother ball of wax. And how do you identify, get to the right data, right? And what is it that you're showing here, especially in the world of transport, right? Are you
Mm-hmm.
classifying correctly? If your customer or client isn't going to fully disclose, you have a problem, and you either have to stop right there and say, let's talk this out, or this is not going to be possible to fully comply if you're not going to disclose. So some issues to run into, but yeah, it's getting better. I think because people are more aware, like you said, we're in another transition phase with the update to the 2024 version of the HazCom standard. As of today's recording, we've just passed one of the major deadlines for substances. OSHA keeps extending out their deadlines, but I think, even given wherever our administration lies with OSHA compliance is still going to remain something at the top of everyone's, attention. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. And you reminded me of a question or thought. In transport, you've got this conflict when you have a controlled substance. You're talking about trade secrets. Controlled substance is another one. And so the DOT wants you to declare what is in the package on the outside of the package. DEA says it's a controlled substance. Are you kidding me? Don't put that on the outside of the box. So, what sort of
right,
recommendation do you have? I mean, it's a conflict, and you have to come up with family-related names, or you try
right,
to find an exception. Thankfully, a lot of these are in tiny quantities that qualify for an exception, where like dangerous goods, an accepted quantity or limited quantity by ground, where you can get out of having to put the proper shipping name and technical chemical name on the outside of the box or on the shipping paper.
Mhm.
But like when have you noticed any sort of problems like that with controlled substances?
I think probably it's along the lines of pharmaceutical too, right? Because so there's another example of where you have another fiefdom or kingdom. We're talking FDA now. So FDA and OSHA don't always like to talk or play nicely together. FDA doesn't need an SDS, but then now you have a workplace for a safety data sheet. That's where you have to identify things, your controlled substances, your drug materials, all of that. But is it, we have to ride that fine line all the time. And it's a balancing game that we have to do here, and where the SDS, again, the concept of all things to all people, who is your audience, and is it necessary to fully identify? As far as I'm concerned, the SDS, is ultimately for the workplace, and how is that defined? The rest of it is just nice to have because of the optional sections. It's a nice to have, not a need to have thing, which many of our customers treat, which I don't necessarily agree with because, like you said, look how important it is to have transport or toxicity
Mm-hmm.
data or anything that further identifies the hazard inherent in transportation, use, storage, all of those things. So it's very important, but I think it's a fine line, and ultimately it gets back to who is your client and how willing are they to work with being in compliance, and I'll put that in quotes too. Right.
Yeah, I'm finding in the modern age that companies are very keen on compliance. I still find individuals that are argumentative. I never had to do this in the past. I've been doing this 30 years. I ain't never had to do that before, right? And so I have to have arguments ready to overcome that issue, and you get into, of course, safety, injuries, death, but you get into fines and penalties, and to try to get their attention. Um, but it is interesting to see. I get that question is like, why don't they all agree on what a flammable liquid is, or why don't they all agree on what regulated is when you think about EPA empty versus DOT empty? They're not the same thing.
Right.
But it's each of the regulations are coming at it from a point of view,
Right.
and, and they're what they need and what they need to warn people about is different in each of the regulatory agencies' cases. So it's interesting to look at the purpose and then how the purpose translates into the rules we read, and as you said, the overlap that is or isn't there.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's fitting that square peg into how many different shaped holes, right? That's what it is. That's ultimately what we're doing. But hopefully you get enough of that communicated to get to the compliance endpoint, however that may be. So, and
Absolutely.
with how we have to deal with safety data sheets, these typically have to be sent with the material or somehow gotten to the end user. Do you find that STSs should be generally sent with the package or inside the package or outside with other transport documents? What's some best practices there?
So I thought originally when I got into this game that, oh, a safety data sheet, they're going to send one in the box with the product the first time somebody is buying it and using it, we're good. And then you realize that transportation says, the driver doesn't know anything about that. The fire department coming and pulling up on the scene of an accident, they can't get to that safety data sheet. So you look in the regs and it says that you will supply, when you have a shipping paper, which is interesting because if you're using an exception like limited quantity or materials of trade or accepted quantity, or the exception for batteries that are under 100 watt hours, you don't have a shipping paper, which means you don't have emergency response information on site, but you might have a safety data sheet inside the box. For those that do the shipping papers, it says provide emergency response information that has the proper shipping name and UN number classification on it. And what a lot of folks think is because FedEx and UPS have the emergency response guidebook, that little, literally, emergency response guide that fire departments and police have, and you can even get it on your cell phone, they think that suffices for the emergency response information. But if you look at the back cover of that book, it says do not use for emergency response information to substitute for the DOT rules. And they use other words, but that's
Sure.
basically what it says. So I like to put an actual safety data sheet with the shipping paper because it does have all the requirement. It has a classification, it has all the warnings, it has the safety stuff. So you end up doing double duty. You put one in the box and you put one with the shipping paper, but you're complying. Now, one thing that I'm waiting for with bated breath is when we get more electronic systems in place so that shipping papers become digitized. And it's interesting to me because rail has always been sort of behind the times. It's a big investment, and you're going to just use the equipment you have as long as you can. But the first place that has an effective electronic version of shipping papers is trains. They've got
Really?
this great system. I went to a presentation, got to talk to people, got to look at stuff, play with stuff. And it's a great system for knowing what's on these rail cars, what unfortunately just spilled in everybody's backyard if there's an accident. Um, and it's supposed to come, I would expect, to air next.
Mhm.
I don't know. It's still paper. Um, ships would be another one because you have time. Ships, you're doing cargo unit load devices, which take a while to fill or are already filled by the shipper. And it seems like that would be a natural place to do electronic paperwork, which means you could supply the safety data sheet electronically.
Mhm.
Trucks, I don't. If we do it in the next decade, I'll be impressed because there's too many variables, too many. Easy example. I do a lot of lithium battery shipments and go to a lot of events where people have to ship out a whole ton of stuff, lithium batteries and more, and they have printers set up temporarily, and they have Wi-Fi set up for the event until you get to the last hour. Wi-Fi goes away, printers go away, and now you have to do things by hand.
Mm.
So you're saving your last shipments of office supplies and batteries and things that at the very end, your electronics tools are very limited, which means you go back to paper, which is acceptable for ground transport. And so it gets weird. Like, how do you supply a safety data sheet if you can't print one?
Right. Right.
How do you do a shipping paper if you can't print one? Well, by hand, you could do that. I'm not writing up a safety data sheet by hand. So you got to think about these things and plan for them and do it ahead of time.
Sure.
Or save everything that's going to go under an exception for last. And that way you
Interesting.
don't have a shipping paper, you don't have to provide emergency response
Right.
information.
To begin with. Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a great conversation, Ken. I appreciate your time here. What would you say for our listeners is a final takeaway you'd have for us regarding this and the world we live in and all the compliance stuff we just talked about?
Oh, heavens. What was the old phrase? Trust but verify? Um, I firmly believe in starting with a safety data sheet. I want one in my hands, but I will look at it with a skeptical eye. So I would say definitely look, but definitely review, and
Great.
then compare it to what you actually have.
Yeah, nice. Great advice. I mean, I think that works in most things in everyday life, right? Trust and verify. Well, great. Thanks again, Ken. It was great to hear from you. And for more about Ken, please visit hackyourhazcom.com where you'll see this episode as well as his contact information. And I'm sure he'd be glad to talk to you about all things transport and beyond. It was a pleasure having you on.
Tanu, thank you so much for the invite and doing this. This was great fun, and I enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you, Ken. All right.